The Denver Broncos head coaching search continues to ramp up, and they interviewed David Shaw, former Stanford Cardinal head coach, who has a track record of success. Now, while he got an interview for the head coaching job, could he be potentially linked to a Jim Harbaugh superstaff? Plus, Patrick Surtain received some really strong praise from his peers in the latest NFLPA first ever All-Pro vote. We break that down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast, or you can watch us in beautiful 4K high definition on youtube.com/LockedOnBroncos. Hit that subscribe or that follow button if you have not done so already, so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more, because we have you covered. For the true fan, there is never an off season. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. The Broncos head coaching search continues to heat up as the team submits requests to interview former coaches and current coaches around the NFL. Not to mention, they're interviewing guys out of the blue that we had no idea that were on the radar, and that was something that happened on Wednesday night, Sayre, as the team interviewed David Shaw, who obviously was the former head coach at Stanford, has a track record of success there, and has built some really good football teams. Now David Shaw has thrown his name into the hat of the Broncos head coaching search.
A very fun addition to the list, Cody. Now the Broncos up to 8 potential candidates, depending on who we see them actually end up interviewing next week. Because as of right now, the Broncos have satisfied the NFL's requirements for the Rooney Rule. So they could make their next head coach hire at any point, whether it is David Shaw or any of the previous candidates to interview, as potentially David Shaw's former boss at Stanford, Jim Harbaugh, Ejiro Evero, another former colleague of Jim Harbaugh's. Cody, I love the inclusion of David Shaw on the list, and I think he deserves some recognition here. As we've talked about before, the Broncos, they didn't exactly cast a very wide net with the initial list of 6 candidates, right? I think that we were kind of in agreement on that. It was a very focused list, bordering on too narrow, in my opinion. I like the addition of candidates like Jim Caldwell and David Shaw for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that those two guys can give you a very good perspective on Russell Wilson. And David Shaw is super, super sharp when it comes to NFL personnel, when it comes to understanding college players, their ability to translate to the NFL into certain schemes. He knows coaching staffs around the league. People got to remember, this is one of my favorite notes that I have about David Shaw in regards to his potential candidacy. I think the fact that he has worked on the NFL draft with NFL Network over the last, I don't know exactly how many years, Cody. He's been doing it with NFL Network for a while now. But every time he's on there, it's not just, all right, a Pac-12 player got picked, let's go to David Shaw for his analysis. No, he's giving analysis on every single pick that gets made. He's giving analysis on the players' fit with the coaches, the assistants at the NFL level. He knows the NFL. I feel like this has been kind of percolating for a while now. I know that David Shaw has been very comfortable in his position at Stanford, but we got to remember there's huge connections here between him, Stanford, the Denver Broncos, obviously Jim Harbaugh. The connections here are worth mentioning and monitoring, because I think it's very big, and it could loom large in terms of the ultimate decision that gets made.
Possibly one of the biggest connections being Condoleezza Rice, who is heading up this search as well, will have an integral voice in that. And if I'm not mistaken, wasn't she just part of the committee to hire the next Stanford head coach? So
she was.
There is a strong connection. Obviously, they know each other, but there's a lot of things here, right? And there's so many people, right? And I think when we talk about coaches, when it's not the biggest name, right, that people like want to hear. Everyone goes for flash, right? Flash and pizzazz. But the reality of the situation is there's some really good coaches. I mean, there are people trying to tell us that Jim Caldwell is not a very good coach, which I just simply can't get on board with. I think that's an absolutely wild take for people to say. David Shaw at Stanford, I mean, he has created a strong culture, and he's been a successful winner, a 96-54 career record as a head coach. He was 5-3 in bowl games. You know, when you're coaching at Stanford, right, it's not like you're going to be able to compete against Alabama or other teams in the SEC. But Stanford was always a challenge inside the Pac-12 and the Pac-10 when it was the Pac-10 at that point. But for him, I think his offensive philosophy, I think, is very interesting, right? I think if he were to be the head coach, he would not be a play caller. I'm sure he'd bring somebody in. But his emphasis and in philosophy is to have a very, very strong rushing attack, and then you set up the pass with that, which if, you keep the writing on the wall, I think that's the formula to win in today's National Football League. Strong running game, set up the pass, and have really good defense, which Denver already does have that. You have a formula to win football games, and that was something that the Broncos missed last year. They were too pass-happy under Nathaniel Hackett's scheme, and that simply was not good enough, and we saw the formula change in the last couple of weeks, run to set up the pass, and all of a sudden Russell Wilson looked really good as a quarterback for the Denver Broncos. I think that's important to kind of mention and to pinpoint there. Obviously, he does have former NFL experience, spent time with, obviously, the Baltimore Ravens, the Las Vegas Raiders, well, the Oakland Raiders at the time, not the Las Vegas. I'm so current now. And then, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit of time with the Philadelphia Eagles. Outside of that, I agree with you with what you said 110%. Who he knows, the connections that he has. Apparently, Shaw has been waiting to work his way back up to the pro level for quite some time. I think it's had to have been the right situation. And Denver could be the right situation, but it may not come as the head coach. Could he be potentially linked as part of a super staff if Jim Harbaugh is opted the job here for the Denver Broncos? That's something you'll get on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn. And as a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. With LinkedIn Jobs, you can hire qualified candidates more efficiently by matching open roles with people who have the skills, the values, and the experiences to help you achieve your goals. LinkedIn Jobs helps you quickly attract qualified candidates to your open jobs with targeting tools. Then go beyond resume data by using insights from your job post, company, and their 875 million member profiles to put your post in front of the most qualified candidates. Identify the most qualified candidates on LinkedIn Jobs and connect with them fast and for free. LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications, all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And our good friends over there at Built Bar. And if you're looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all the fat and the calories, well, you got to try a Built Bar today. I'm telling you, it's one of the best things that you will put in your mouth. And Built Bars, here's the thing about it, right? What if I were to tell you that a protein bar that's wrapped in 100% milk chocolate is one of the healthiest things that you can put inside your body here in 2023? Well, that is the reality. And look, I tell you what, they taste even better than a candy bar. They have flavors like peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. They also have cherry orange. They have some other flavors as well. For Locked On Broncos listeners, you've been able to get your box of Built Bar at Built.com. But now, what if I were to tell you that you can get it close to you locally without having to wait for shipping? You can head to your local Walmart to get a box of Built Bar, or you could go to your local Sam's Club to get a bulk box of Built Bar here today. 17 grams of protein, 100% milk chocolate, the best bang for your buck here for 2023. Check it out today, Built Bar. And I promise you will thank Sarah and I later once you try Built Bar for the first time. Could David Shaw be a potential Harbaugh offensive coordinator candidate if Harbaugh is the man for the job in Denver. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do us a quick favor. Hit that like button down below and comment for the algorithm. Share your thoughts on today's episode of the show. Share your thoughts on David Shaw. Share your thoughts on Jim Harbaugh and a potential super staff, and interact with everybody else in Broncos Country. See you in the comments. This is a very, very interesting question here, Sayre. I think a lot of fans are so fixated on one or two guys that you and I have talked about ad nauseum on this podcast. But let's say Jim Harbaugh is the head coaching candidate. I think a lot of questions kind of present itself as, okay, based on the interview panel so far, Sayre, could David Shaw be a potential Harbaugh offensive candidate? And does Jim Harbaugh have a potential super staff on his hands here?
I think, Cody, there's a chance that he does, right? I don't know that Jim Harbaugh would jump to the NFL without some kind of big idea for a staff that he could put together. And look, I may be a little bit spoiled by this, and Broncos Country in general may be a little bit spoiled because remember in 2019 when it was, Mike Munchak was going to be the next head coach of the team and everybody was so sure that was going to happen. And you were kind of like, no, I think I'm hearing it's Vic Fangio. And so the Broncos end up hiring Vic Fangio and getting Mike Munchak anyway. And I thought, like, man, that's kind of like a best case scenario, right? You kind of feel like this one guy is going to be your head coach, or he's a really strong candidate to be the head coach, and he ends up getting hired on as an assistant anyway. That would be a great scenario for the team to happen again here in 2023. So if Jim Harbaugh is coming up to the NFL, you've got to think that he's pulled out his Rolodex. He's calling the numbers. He's pulling up David Shaw's number, all these other guys. And I think he is going to build a super staff. And just based on the candidates that have interviewed and some other tea leaves that we can read, right? I think we've got something maybe figured out here, Cody. The head coach, Jim Harbaugh, quarterbacks coach and assistant head coach Jim Caldwell. I would love this, that we could do a whole segment or episode on this, but I would love it if Jim Caldwell was the guy in charge of coaching Russell Wilson on a day-to-day basis. I think that would be just outstanding, fantastic. David Shaw as the offensive coordinator. I know that, we talked about if he's the head coach, obviously he wouldn't call the plays, but he has called plays for Jim Harbaugh before. He's been his offensive coordinator before, so that could be a good working relationship there, something that they're familiar with. And then, like you mentioned yesterday, what if Mike Munchak, comes back to coach the offensive line? I think that would be a ton of fun. I think the players would respond well to that. And obviously, Munchak is a very good developer of talent. And then Ejiro Evero, another guy who's interviewed for the head coaching position. Could he return as defensive coordinator, if not as the head coach? I think there's a very good possibility of that, Cody, although I don't want to sell him short, as in his opportunities with teams like the Colts, the Texans, and others who may call him up to interview. If he doesn't get those jobs, I think it'd be great to have Ejiro Evero back as defensive coordinator. And of course, if Jim Harbaugh is the head coach, could kind of be cool full circle for Jerry Rosburg too, to potentially come back to his staff. So I like the idea of a super staff, Cody. I like the idea, on paper, of all these guys coming. Obviously, we don't have a clue if that's going to happen, but it would certainly be great for the players. And I think it would be great for just a change up from what we've seen in the past from the Denver Broncos.
Just the names that you listed. That's like a super staff wet dream right here when you talk about like all these major players. And I think that, what have we talked about? The offense needs to transform in the biggest way. I think if you had, obviously, Jim Harbaugh as a head coach, you had Caldwell as a quarterback associate head coach, and you had David Shaw as the OC, and they were to bring back Mike Munchak, that I feel like would be on paper, right? It looks beautiful on paper. Obviously, I think it would have to take some time to formulate everything, but it's hard to imagine that would not be a really good staff to have on the offensive side of the ball. And we'll see what they decide to do. I still think that even if Mike Munchak comes back, I still think that there's a chance that Ben Steele stays on as the assistant the assistant offensive line coach. Sorry, I mispronounced that there. There's been a lot of good reviews about Ben Steele. So Chris Cooper, as we all know, got the big-time job in Minnesota as their offensive line coach. We know that he and Munch were really close and really tight there. So we'll have to see how things go. But, man, I kind of warming up to the idea. And you know what? I'll take it a step further. Secondary coach. I hope they bring back Christian Parker. I had a chance to speak with him on Sunday after the Chargers game, and I said, hey, you are a heck of a teacher. Like, I get to watch him coach the defensive backs every single day. This guy is such a smart football mind, Sayre, and he understands secondaries, he understands wide receiver splits, and you talk to any of the defensive backs, they're like, hey, CP's legit. Like, Justin Simmons loves CP. Surtain loves CP, and he's a great coach. I hope he stays on, but if not, I know that he will land on his feet. I mean, he might even become a coordinator for some team around the National Football League. So, all things considered, I think that would be a really nice super staff if we're really talking about that as well. In Broncos country, I mean, what were your thoughts? Like, if Sayre's projection of a potential super staff were Jim Harbaugh, Jim Caldwell, David Shaw, Mike Munchak coming back to coach the O-line, Ejiro Evero as DC, and our good friend Jerry Rosburg as special teams coordinator, how would you feel as a member of Broncos country about that? Let us know in the comments down below, or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But Broncos country, the NFLPA empowered players to use their voice to vote for all pro awards, right? Media is always voting for this person as offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, all pro, so on and so forth. And oftentimes, not a lot of media members watch the full scope of the National Football League. So the NFLPA put the power in the hands of the players, and peers recognized Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain as an all-pro. Where did he land on that list? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league that is out there, from pro football to pro basketball. We have everything at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and the easiest way to get your betting info, so head to the website today or use your mobile device. BetOnline, where the game starts. Denver Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain, in his second season with the franchise, continued to exceed expectations and play beyond his status as a first-round pick, and his peers across the NFL, they recognize that. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much for listening to us on your way to work, your morning cup of coffee, your morning workout, or watching us on YouTube on your smartphone, your computer, or your smart TV. We appreciate you so much for making us a part of your day. Broncos country means the world to us. Sayre, my friend, Patrick Surtain, the NFLPA, empowered players. They said, okay, you know what? Enough is enough. Like the media votes every year, right? And this has been a process that's been ongoing for quite some time. But the media, often at times, as we've seen, they don't pay attention to everything and every player around the NFL. You know who knows every player pretty well? Players around the NFL. They probably pay more attention because they watch more film on nearly everybody in the National Football League. So the NFLPA released their first ever player-led vote for All-Pro, and Patrick Surtain was a first-team selection by his peers. But here's the catch, Sayre. Okay, right? We talked about the NFL Top 100, and it's just, everyone's voting for this person, this person, this person. Teammates were not allowed to vote for their own teammates, which was a nice little wrinkle added in there. And it was a little bit different in terms of criteria. So defensive backs, they voted on the wide receivers, the tight ends, and the wide receivers and tight ends, they voted on the defensive backs. On top of that, defensive backs voted for defensive backs. And Patrick Surtain, alongside Philadelphia Eagles cornerback Darius Slay, took home All-Pro first-team honors as recognized by their peers. I mean, that's huge, Sayre. I can't imagine there being anything bigger than that type of recognition from your peers, and for him to be alongside Darius Slay and for everything that Surtain has done in his second year. Tell you what, I'd still pick him 10 times out of 10 if I had to go back and redo the 2021 NFL draft. I mean, he truly is a fantastic player.
He's really a star, isn't he? I mean, he's the truest form of a superstar. When you talk about just a guy who gets it done on the field, guy who just goes about his business every single day. Surtain's not really much of a talker out there. You don't hear him making a ton of headlines in terms of guy like Sauce Gardner, who plays with a little bit more flash, got a little bit more of the Deion Sanders kind of gene in him, right? But Pat Surtain is just, he's a quiet superstar, which I think speaks volumes to the fact that he's getting voted by his peers. He's not out there making a bunch of headlines for letting his talk do the talking. He's letting his play do all the talking. And I love the fact that he's getting respected. Like you mentioned, those specific criteria, that's really important in this, because you're talking about guys that go up against him and guys who are trying to match his level of play, right? So that really speaks volumes. And in addition to that, I thought it was fascinating. Joe Burrow, the Bengals quarterback, was asked about who's the best corner in the league. He also said Pat Surtain. So even though he didn't necessarily have a vote, that way, the fact that he goes up against, Marlon Humphrey twice a year, the fact that he plays against some really good corners in practice every day, things like that there in the AFC North, I think that speaks volumes. And Surtain, statistically, we've seen his production matches what people say about him, which I think is great. But it's hard sometimes to really statistically quantify a great cornerback, isn't it? I mean, it's getting better and easier nowadays when you can measure passer rating against, or completion percentage allowed per target, or yards allowed per target, things like that. People want to look directly to interceptions. They want to look directly to pass breakups. But the fact of the matter is, Surtain has been everything and then some in terms of shutting down his side of the field.
I mean, he's held his own against guys like Davante Adams. That first matchup, he won that matchup against Davante. I mean, he shut out Mike Williams when they played on Monday Night Football. And look, Davante Adams got him back in that overtime game, and that's a really good thing. Like, I feel like a guy like Surtain needed a moment like that to kind of like, okay, like we thought, like, hey, is there anything that's like, is there any weakness in his game? Like, I don't think there's really any weakness in Surtain's game at all. But it's like, it's good to see that, okay, he is human a little bit in the aspect of his on-field play. And on top of that, you see him bounce back. And I think that for him, it's rare you do that. And for Joe Burrow specifically, hey, shout out Joe Burrow. Okay, I'm pulling out for the Bengals to win the Super Bowl because of all the love that he's shown towards Patrick Surtain. But he said, I played against him in college, and he's unbelievable. And I think that kind of speaks to it. But what is one area that we collectively said, okay, hey, here's where Patrick Surtain can get better, right? It was being a more consistent tackler. And I tell you what, I felt like he was probably Denver's most consistent tackler on the secondary side of things outside of Justin Simmons. I think that he was everywhere. I mean, there were times we see him come up and smack people. The Jacksonville Jaguars game is a great example where Trevor Lawrence throws it out of the backfield to the running back, and Surtain just comes up, screams, and bam, huge tackle for a loss. Surtain is not afraid of contact, and I think he's just finding ways to get more and more comfortable, which, to be honest with you, the more comfortable he gets, I think that's scary for the rest of the NFL, because the way that the offensive game is transitioning to becoming this focal point that the NFL wants to see, I mean, we see little things now deemed as pass interference or defensive holding, which is nuts, but Surtain, I think, is an anomaly that can kind of overcome a little bit of some of the rules that the NFL has put in place. I'm truly blown away by him. Let me ask you a question. Would you still draft him with the 9th overall pick if you had to go back and redo it?
I would, Cody. You know me. I always of fell in line with the veteran quarterback option. Like I don't know where Justin Fields would be today if his first 2 years in the NFL were Pat Shurmur and then Nathaniel Hackett and the staff the Broncos currently, just more recently had. So obviously Luke Getsy did a good job getting him at least to a position where he could excel in areas that he's very good at this year. The question now becomes, I think there's still a question with Ryan Poles as the GM in Chicago. Are they going to stick with Justin Fields? Are they going to roll with Bryce Young? Are they going to try to trade that pick? I think a lot of Bears fans and Bears people would say it'd be foolish to move on from Fields after the progress he showed. But look, you have a legit first team All-Pro at one of the hardest positions to find them. Like, the other All-Pro is Darius Slay. He's been in the league for a very long time. And there's good young corners in the NFL. That's not to say that just because you didn't make first team All-Pro, you're not a good corner. I think it does speak volumes to the fact that, man, the Broncos found somebody at the 9th overall pick. I've brought this up before. Guys like Pat Surtain don't go 9th overall in the NFL draft. They go like Sauce did this past year in the top 5. They go, in the top 5 picks because corner is a premium position. Not that quarterback isn't, but I think the Broncos have had a plan for a long time to potentially get a Rodgers or a Wilson, or as we see more and more now these days, like Derek Carr, he's going to be playing for a new team in 2023. Quarterbacks are becoming available, veteran guys that can help your team right away, as opposed to trying to draft the next guy and develop them and hope that you can keep up with Mahomes and Herbert and Burrow and all these other things. you can't always bank on that, right? You actually can't at all bank on that. You can try, and the Broncos have tried and failed, with Paxton Lynch and others. I think they did the right thing. I think they took the best player there. I think they went about attacking the quarterback position properly, and I think they made the right decision.
I'm with you 110%. Now, the next thing that is coming up is the AP All-Pro vote, and hopefully hopefully they recognize where Surtain is. But in my opinion, I feel like I value more of the players' votes for each other than I do other media members, because I know for a fact, and look, there's some media members I work with that openly acknowledge they absolutely do not watch anybody but the Broncos, right? And it's like you have to watch every game. You have to know different pieces, different players around the National Football League. And for players to have that recognition for Surtain, I think that's huge. And so I'm going to value the player vote a little bit more. So hats off to the NFLPA for launching that initiative for the first time ever this season. Broncos country, let us know your thoughts down below on the head coaching search for the Broncos. We highlighted David Shaw being interviewed as a potential head coaching candidate, but also, could he be a member of a Jim Harbaugh super staff if Harbaugh is the guy in Denver? We're eager for your thoughts on that. Plus, we just highlighted Patrick Surtain's recognition amongst his peers on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. But Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. We'll be back for another episode on Mondays. We break down the latest in the head coaching search, what type of traction is going to build up there. On top of that, some other Broncos news that you'll get that on Monday's episode, Locked on Broncos.